good evening or good late afternoon to everyone. I am Kristóf Nagy from KMK, and I will introduce this lecture of Grim Feinberg today. The title of the lecture is "What Can the Perspective of Borderlands Internationalism Offer for Art Historians?" And I'm saying it primarily for the future watchers of the video recording that we are sitting at the Central European Research Institute for Art History, KMK in Budapest, and this lecture is organized in the framework of a research project on the art of the 1980s in Hungary and in Central Eastern Europe that we are running with Julius Huth since 2022. We have recently published a book based on this project, as part of this project, and we are also planning an international conference for the next year. And for us, this lecture by Grim Feinberg is especially important because we aim a kind of regional scaling up of our research project. However, when we are talking about a regional scaling up, we know that we should do more than purely putting next to each other the national cases or national containers, but we have this kind of interest to pay attention on international, let's say, cooperations and dependencies and so on. And this is one of the reasons why for today we invited Grim Feinberg from the Czech Academy of Sciences, who is in this spring a senior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the Central European University, still in Budapest. And he's also the editor of the journal Kontradikce, published in Prague. And his current research project is on internationalism. And I believe that this talking about internationalism in art is especially important because it's definitely a problematic concept, but I guess it's especially timely to talk about it nowadays or today when we are witnessing this kind of falling apart of the post-World War international order that characterized also this region in the last decades or last half a century. And in this time, we will learn about this project that focuses on the historical forms of internationalism in this kind of multi-ethnic regions of Central Eastern Europe. And what is especially important that it's a work in progress project. I guess you will expand on it. But so you have the opportunity to hear something that is unwritten or at least unpublished. And I guess it will make the Q&A and the discussion especially exciting and important. And moreover, and I am getting to the end of my notes, that we asked Joe not only to recap his project, but also to reflect on what can art historians learn from the perspective of Borderlands Internationalism, a term that you will, I guess, introduce quite soon. And I guess it was hopefully a fair request towards you because you also have a strong interest in arts and culture. And among others, you wrote an introduction and edited the English version of Karel Teige's The Marketplace of Art, which was published 2 years ago, if I am right, or 3. And the format of this evening will be that first I will give the mic to Joe for a lecture, which will be around 45 minutes. Then I will formulate a few questions and comments, and then we will open up the floor for the audience. So please prepare your questions and comments and any other thing that you would like to share. And hopefully we will have this kind of lively discussion after the lecture. So I'm looking forward to the lecture, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. And when I get to about 45 minutes, you can nudge me or something. I'll try to watch the time, but I might get excited and talk too much. Let me say, first of all, that I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad for the opportunity to talk to you about this topic, not only to present what I've already been working on, but to kind of respond to the challenge that Kristóf presented me of asking what my concept of Borderlands Internationalism might have to say to art historians and about art history. I'll get to that more in the form of some open-ended questions at the end, since although I am very interested in theory of culture, literature, aesthetics. I am not very well informed about art history as such, so I'll really be glad to have. I'm glad to have the opportunity to lay out put forth some ideas and see how you might respond and how we might together think in some new directions, possibly. That's at least the exciting potential of this once we get to the discussion. But I'll start with some of the kind of the basic principles or the basic way that I see art and culture fitting into the project that I'm going to be presenting, which is that I approach this through the question of politics not as a field that's sort of already determined, but asking the question of where the borders of politics are. So while I'm developing this concept of Borderlands Internationalism out of study of what you might call political history of East Central Europe, I am interested all along in what makes it into politics and what's left out of politics at each moment, and how, most importantly, how that element that's left out of politics at a certain moment might come back, either gently, politely, or sometimes explosively. But also, I'm interested in what is specific about the borderlands of East Central Europe when I worked through this concept. And to put some of these basic points out there to start with, I think my thesis is that the borderlands of East Central Europe are a space where, even more acutely than elsewhere, the political needs what I call the extra-political. We can think of this from one perspective in light of this common observation that in East Central Europe, politics so often play out in the realm of culture. This is often seen as a result of limited access to the political sphere when a certain group of people who want to change their society can't do so through political channels, they turn to culture. This is one way of putting it, and I think that's part of the issue. But I also want to challenge this maybe simple image of bad politics versus good warriors of culture, and look into how the borders of the political themselves are called into question and shift over time. And how it's not that culture is inherently better than politics, though it's nice to think so sometimes, but that in such conditions, when the political becomes a question, when the political is too self-contained and too isolated from the social and cultural elements outside it, then culture becomes a site of determining what the political is. And this is my second thesis, that in this situation at the borderlands, the locus or location of art itself becomes a question. So when the borders of politics are underdetermined, so might be the borders around the art that confronts politics. In the borderlands region, what I mean by that I'll get to in a minute, cultural actors are continually aware of their marginality with regard to established centers of power. And so these cultural actors themselves are compelled to keep asking not only what art should be done, but where art is. They might respond that art is located principally in the imperial or post-imperial capital, or they might respond that it's located in a national sphere that emerges as a kind of counterpublic, or they might think towards another kind of space where art can be neither imperial nor national, but internationalist. And so the question then arises what that might mean. But first, what I mean by Borderlands internationalism. I set out with the suggestion that internationalism in general is not the same as other forms of universalism, that it's best understood as a response to perceived inadequacies, not only of nationalism, but also of earlier forms of universalism. And this is why I think it's worth studying as a phenomenon in its own right. There's a lot of research out there and philosophies of cosmopolitanism, universalism, through history going back to the ancient world. But I think there's something new that emerges historically around starting in the mid-19th century, and it really gets worked out as an idea in the late 19th century. And especially in the borderlands, and especially in the borderlands of East Central Europe, which is where the socialist movement for the first time was confronted with not just the abstract idea that socialism should be internationalist, which was already something stated in the early 19th century, but that it had to be, that this was a problem that had to be worked out concretely in every local space where socialists were organizing. And so this then compelled the international socialist movement to respond to what was happening in East Central Europe. So in some ways, this Borderlands internationalism, it became paradigmatic of internationalism as a general phenomenon, but it also took specific form in this time and place. And I think by looking back to these specific forms, we can bring them back into our present discussions that I'll leave maybe for the end or for our discussion afterwards. But so there's both a spatial and a temporal dimension to the concept. The spatial dimension gets to this concept of borderlands, which is a term that I borrow from the historian, political historian Eric Blanc, who in a book called Revolutionary Social Democracy follows the socialist movements of the non-Russian speaking peoples of the late Russian Empire, showing just how important the socialist movements were outside of that. That you can't understand what was happening in Russia if you only look at the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks to understand the process that led up to 1917 and 1918. We need to look throughout the region, throughout the different language groups. He points out, for example, that the Finnish Social Democratic Party had twice as many members as the Bolsheviks. The Polish socialist parties, of which there were two, were also at many points larger than the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Jewish Socialist Bund, again, at many moments was larger and also was founded before the Russian Social Democratic Party, and so on. So I'm interested in this reminder that there was a lot happening in the borderlands away from imperial centers, but I abstract a bit from this usage that Eric Blanc makes. I'm interested in what happens both sides of the imperial borders. So on the Russian and German side, on the Russian and Austro-Hungarian side, Russian Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian Ottoman. I'm interested in these areas where empires met and competed for territory, but also for support of diverse populations that they struggled to persuade to be a part of their project, but also to integrate and control. So I don't see the borderlands as a single region with clear outlines, but rather as a relational situation between interconnected regions. And I refer to the region as I go on as East Central Europe rather than simply Central or Eastern Europe, though all of these terms have their advantages and disadvantages. But what I'm most interested in is neither the centrality of the region nor its easternness as such, but the way borderlands can be seen as central, not because of their being close to the centers of power, but because they are between centers of power. And so I'm looking at the eastern margins of the part of Europe that claims centrality, which is also between Western Europe and Eastern Europe that have their own claims to a certain kind of centrality of power. I also look at the borderlands as an area, again, that's not just space on a map, but a vast area where hegemonic cultural practices and political institutions that belong to one empire, or later, as we might take it further, to one post-imperial order, they might be made into a question. So these are spaces where an individual or a movement can't take for granted what language should be spoken, what institutions they participate in, but rather has to choose whether they will speak Russian or German or Hungarian or Turkish, which might be the language of imperial administration in one place or another, or they might choose the language of the local cultural elites, for example, Polish or German, or in some places French. They might choose the language of the majority language of the countryside, which might be Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Slavic, Macedonian, or a language that might not even have, that might not find protection even in the wave of nationalist defense of peasant culture, but belatedly begins to demonstrate and demand recognition of its cultural richness, languages like Yiddish or Romani. So seen in this light, the borderlands can move, and they can even enter imperial capitals insofar as there too the hegemony of imperial institutions might be incomplete. So for example, if we look at Slovak stonemasons who moved to Budapest and maybe for the first time in their lives are faced with the question of whether they are Slovak or Magyar Hungarian or Hungaros Hungarian, in Slovak Uhorci versus Magyari, or Czech brick makers who are a major part of first they're seen as strike breakers in Vienna, and then they become a major part of the workers' movement in Vienna, or in, for example, Greeks and Armenians and Jews demanding local representation or national representation or cultural representation in a place like Constantinople. So the important thing is the political position, or more precisely, the extra political positioning of actors in space who might see themselves at a certain moment as being left out of established politics and figuring out how to respond to this situation. So this is a geographic dynamic that we can find in East Central Europe, arguably up to the present, but it's a dynamic that emerges with with a specific temporality that was not there at one point in time, and by the present has already changed several more times. At the beginning of this dynamic, there are empires that presented their civilizational projects as universal, worthy of encompassing everyone under their vertical domination. Then at a second moment, there are national movements that counter these claims, that demand recognition, and envision a horizontal equality of separate nationalities. But then following this is the key moment in the story that I'm interested in retelling. There's a new social movement that sweeps through the region and radically reimagines the possibilities of a future geography where peoples need neither to be separated nor to be dominated. And they try to figure out together what that might mean. So internationalism then comes after nationalism, which itself came after imperial universalism. And internationalism then is a historic innovation, not fully contained in earlier ideas. So whereas universalism connected to imperial projects could take some kind of already existing hegemonic culture and declare that this culture was universally desirable and inclusive, and nationalism could respond to this by making new national cultures in the image of imperial culture, but with stricter boundaries. Something new happens when there's a socialist movement that sees any future unification of peoples not being based on the already existing cultural structures, but on some new cultural structures. And this happens especially, this process of imagining happens especially in East Central Europe during the years between roughly 1880, when there were almost no large internationalist socialist organizations in the region, and 1913, when there are such organizations almost everywhere. Just to go through a few examples. In 1878, the they call it Czechoslovak Social Democratic Party in Austria is founded. The Austrian Social Democratic Party, coming out of some other smaller parties, and then including the Czech Party, is founded in 1889. The Social Democratic Party of Hungary in 1890, Polish Socialist Party 1892, its rival Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland 1893, the Romanian Social Democratic Party 1893 also, the Bulgarian Party 1894, the Croatian Slavonic Party the same year, the Lithuanian Party 1896, the Jewish Labor Bund 1897, the Russian Social Democratic Party 1898, the Slovenian Yugoslav Party 1898 as well, the Ukrainian Social Democratic Party 1899, Serbian 1903, Latvian 1904, Estonian 1905, the Slovak Social Democratic Party that ends up being more or less part of the Hungarian Party 1906, the Social Democratic Party of Bosnia-Herzegovina 1909, the Multi-Ethnic Socialist Workers' Federation of Salonika, or today Thessaloniki, is formed in 1908. Just a few of these parties, but by this time, socialist parties are everywhere, and they start having mass. After having started with being small organizations of intellectuals and like student agitators, by this time they're mass parties with a mass base. One thing that might be that you might have already noted in listening to this list of emerging parties is that none of them is unambiguously the party of an entire state, much less of a nation state. So even though the Russian Social Democrats aspired to be an all-Russian party, they repeatedly fell out with the parties of other nationalities, and in some cases they never really claimed to represent, for example, the Finnish workers. They were ambivalent about Polish workers, and they had long-standing complicated relations with the other social democratic parties around them. The Austrian and Hungarian Social Democrats, they had more success in this regard of being all national or all state parties, except that neither of them ever claimed to represent both sides of the dual monarchy. And the rest of these parties brought together peoples that either did not have states, sometimes did not have a very clear definition of who they were as peoples, and yet they felt some need to have their own organizations. And at the same time, they all claimed to be internationalist and claimed to be different from the nationalist parties that already existed around them. And if we compare this to the large socialist parties of say, Germany, France, the Netherlands, England, the United States, even in Belgium, binational country. All of those parties were founded from the first as all-national parties, which knew right from the start where their constituency was, and never felt compelled to deal with the national question as a major issue of internal politics. They dealt with it when they dealt with what was happening in other countries, especially, for example, when the Polish Socialist Party feuded with Rosa Luxemburg's social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland over whether the International should support Polish independence. Then everyone in Western Europe has to figure out what their position is about Polish independence. But when they're left to their own organizing, they don't tend to deal with the national question as a major issue. But the socialist parties of East Central Europe couldn't avoid the national question, and they took a wide variety of positions, either for national independence or as with the Polish Socialist Party, or some like the Jewish Labor Bund or the Socialist Workers' Federation of Salonika. They took into consideration the thought that some nations may never have a legitimate claim on their own territory, and they took up the idea of non-territorial cultural autonomy, an idea that's often imprecisely referred to as Austro-Marxism. And then there were other parties that explicitly opposed the independence of the nations that they were supposedly representing, like the Czech Social Democrats or Rosa Luxemburg's Social Democrats in Poland and Lithuania. And many of these organizations, in some ways, to some extent, all of them felt the need to start thinking about what a future order would be that would include many nationalities in some kind of a federation where they would look beyond the needs or the demands of one nation, but also not taking for granted that we already know what nations and states are there around, but reimagining some future system of cultural autonomy, national federations, transnational federations, and so on. This legacy has been somewhat obscured by developments that came later after what I would regard as the high water mark of East Central European Borderlands Internationalism. There's the famous moment in 1914 when World War I breaks out and socialist parties throughout Europe support their countries in the war against other countries that are represented also by other socialist parties. You have, therefore, socialists who are internationalists but fighting each other in the trenches in World War I. And this historical moment is an important moment of reckoning that deserves to be continually thought through over and over again. But it also has sometimes the effect of historically just erasing everything that happened before 1914, as if that was a complete failure and every new attempt at internationalism has to start from scratch. And I'd like to look at that again, first of all, to remember that there were many factions and parties that opposed the war, not only, most famously, the Bolsheviks and the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland, Rosa Luxemburg's party, but also many of the positions held by these parties, and especially those parties in Central and Eastern Europe. They had very complicated relationships to their state, whereas it was more straightforward in the case of French socialists who might either directly support the war effort insofar as they saw it as a defensive war and hope that it didn't become an offensive war and so on. But in this in Central and Eastern Europe, there were some parties that didn't identify with the state at all, others that identified with the state precisely because it was multinational, and it was actually their anti-nationalism that led them to hesitate to oppose the state when they saw the rising power of nationalist separatism or pan-Slavic threats, and so on. So this is a complicated issue that I think it doesn't immediately. Well, what it says is that working out the problems of internationalism are probably never easy when push comes to shove, but it doesn't necessarily tell us that any later idea solved the problem in a simpler way or a better, an a priori better way. Also, this past is somewhat obscured by the new order of socialist parties after 1917, when the political scene is really divided between communist parties that have one specific vision of internationalism, which does vary over time and place, but is largely based on some interpretation of Lenin and Stalin's writing about the territorial rights of nationalities, versus social democratic parties that tend, on the contrary, to favor the emerging nation states with tolerance of national minorities, but with no longer making a push to radically reimagine the state system and the system of nationalities in Europe. And then looking through the rest of the world, we have the emergence of anti-colonial internationalism that rightly gained the attention of historians and social theorists and political theorists, but which again I think becomes problematic when applied too hastily to East Central Europe, where the situation was and I think continues to be quite different from the situation of colonialism in the global South. So I want to look back at these ideas from this region or this system of regions from this time period and dig them up from the rubble of history so that we can then consider what they might tell us about the present. What I think emerges from this historical, let's say, excursion into the past, which I'm still actually working on researching and writing, but what my preliminary idea is that there emerges, first of all, a kind of universalism of the left out. So a claim on universal emancipation that differs from the universalism that already thinks it knows from the start what is universal and what can be applied everywhere, but instead looks at the universal from the perspective of particular entities that think they haven't been included in some previous iteration of the universal. So I see this as an idea that it's an elaboration of ideas that were already rhetorically gestured towards for example, in the socialist movements of the earlier parts of the 19th century. Marx says things like, the workers have no country, but he doesn't quite explain what that means. This is from the Communist Manifesto, and in the same manifesto he presumes that communist parties will, in every country, operate on their own national level. And so they struggle within the country, but they have no nation. But he doesn't quite explain what either of those levels means, especially in a context when we don't know what that country might be that the workers don't have. And I also see this kind of universalism of the left out as a precursor to ideas like the border thinking or critical cosmopolitanism that's been theorized later by figures like Walter Mignolo, or insurgent universality theorized by Massimiliano Tomba. I think we can come to these ideas through the analysis of different historical material that hasn't been worked through to the same extent as the colonial situation that post-colonial theory has focused on, or the French Revolution that someone like Tomba looks at. A second aspect of this type of universality that I'm looking at is that I consider it minor in the sense theorized by Deleuze and Guattari. So it might be worth recalling that they themselves base their analysis of minor literature on the case of East Central Europe. They're looking at the language of Kafka, who wrote in German, though he didn't feel that he was German, who was interested in Czech, considered Czech to be his mother's tongue, and sometimes his mother tongue, but he didn't feel he could write in it, who was fascinated by Yiddish, which was spoken by previous generations of his family, and which fascinated him when it came in the Yiddish theater to Prague, and yet he settled on writing in a German that makes use of the local non-standard variety of Prague German. So this is the basis of Deleuze and Guattari's analysis. It's an analysis of a borderlands situation, and where they say that the minor cultural form can be more revolutionary than a major form that's already established, because the major form takes for granted its politics and the collectivity that it's connected to and the language that it speaks. In the major literatures, the social milieu becomes a background, like a setting for individual affairs. But in minor literatures, even the most private affairs are immediately connected to politics. Linguistic expression itself becomes a matter of expressing yet unformed and unarticulated collectivities. A minor language, already deterritorialized by its disconnection from standardized forms and established forms, it can become more experimental. They invoke the case of James Joyce, an Irishman writing in English. They don't point out that he was writing for a lot of this time in various parts of East Central Europe, to the extent that Trieste, as part of Austria-Hungary, is a not quite Austrian part of Austria-Hungary, where he met lots of figures who came through from the other nationalities, the many nationalities of this monarchy, and that he made the hero of his Dublin-bound Ulysses is this deterritorialized Jew from Central Europe, actually from Hungary. Bloom in the character in the book is the son of Hungarian Jews, I think. But I think there's something missing from Deleuze and Guattari's analysis, and that's precisely this situation of the East Central European borderlines, which they kind of take it as something that's maybe, they mention Prague and they mention Warsaw, and they mention the specific problems of a Jew writing in German in Prague, but I don't think they take into account quite enough the situation of the borderlands where all the languages either were minor or could be written in minor keys, where there was Imperial German, but there was also Prague German, Budapest German, the German of Timișoara, Timișoara. One could write in Great Russian, but one could also take the position of Little Russian, and one could call it Ukrainian and make another statement by doing that. One could write in Polish, invoking the noble tradition of Polish as a language with a great literary past and a noble past, or one could write like Bruno Schulz, trying to explore the potentialities of Polish as a minor, might call it a minor literature of its own, that is a Polish of its own borderlands, of its eastern borderlands. Or we could look at the Czech language, which Czech literature could try to revive the great tradition of the Czech aristocracy that had been broken long ago. But it could also be the Czech of someone like Jaroslav Hašek, who was a contemporary of Kafka, whose Good Soldier Švejk captures the unstandardized speech of the pubs of Bohemia and the kind of Germanized Czech babble of a language that's used in the Austro-Hungarian military, in the Czech parts of the military there. So I think that this minor standpoint, the important thing for me is that it offers a view of the world that the major standpoint can't necessarily see, because it takes global idioms for granted rather than making them into problems. Whereas major cultural forms, they tend to lay claim to the international or the universal by virtue of scale, the greatness of being part of a global cultural canon, presumed ability to apply this great culture to the whole world, on the basis of reason or truth or the extent of its power and so on. But a minor internationalism, I think it can be international without being grand. All it needs is to articulate the universal and the particular in some small local fragmentary form. So that's what I think we can look for when we study particular cases in this region. We can look at how the world appeared and took shape, not immediately on an all-global scale, but in a specific time and place in East Central Europe in multiple forms. And that also implies that this process of making the world appear is a process of the imagination, of imagining. And that is why I see that it's not only a matter of political discussion, but of extra-political processes and actions and practices, including art. But I thought I would say a few things before I get into that, a few things about method that seem to be part of what Krzysztof said is what you are working through in some of your research. So I'll kind of think about how I look at method. When I try to move past both the universal kind of the idea of universal history that few people try to write nowadays, but also national history that is still written quite a bit nowadays. Universal history would see that we already know the end point of historical progress, and so we can retell the history of the world by choosing what contributes, what gets us to this end point, the way a storyteller picks the most important. And the storyteller knows the ending already at the start and picks out what's most important, what is world historical and what isn't. The problem with national history is it reacted to this. It rightly pointed out the incompleteness of this kind of universal history. But by effectively saying, we also have that kind of history. History writing became a process of kind of competing to demonstrate that our nation also has something that is almost as good, or maybe even as good as, or analogous to what universal history has. There's someone else has Shakespeare, but we also have we have our great playwrights. Goethe is representative of universal history. Well, we have Madách, and we can kind of to each great poet we can say, well, we also have our Mickiewicz, who is as good a poet as Byron, and it's in most cases I wouldn't, well, in the case of Madach, maybe I would question it. But in most cases, I wouldn't question the aesthetic judgment. But I just read it, so it's fresh in my mind. But what we have is trying this kind of, the national history tries to do the same thing as the universal history but on a national level, rather than trying to see how something different can be done, precisely because the position of writing or thinking politically or questioning politics or making art is different, and this positionality offers a different inroad to history. And so what I'm interested in doing is exploring how this marginality can be found in cultural expression and political and extra-political expression, which often means looking at minor players, so not focusing as much on the great works, the great thinkers, great artists, but on how other people who've been forgotten by history respond to those great works, how a whole kind of field might emerge, and but also how maybe something could be considered a great work, but it's a different kind of greatness if it's a greatness that it emerges by questioning the whole structure of universal literary, like world literature or universal political history or so on. And so it's a matter of looking at how the particular is realized by passing through the universal, changing the universal as it goes, not just accepting the universal as already being what it was from the start. And so I'm interested in kind of this means I'm interested in the social and epistemic structuring of multiple ways of telling history. So the question of what is selected in the telling of history, I find it should be also part of the research itself, whether the position taken, what the framework is that's taken in the study of history, and that I think then it's that we can then look at kind of how borderlands emerge in many of these cases, and how the figure of the borderland is a relational figure. So we can, of course, look at what happens in Vienna or Berlin, or Petersburg, but we can also look at Budapest and Prague and Warsaw, but then we can also look at Lviv, at Bratislava, Košice, Užhorod. We can look at these different kind of moments of marginality and how they say something different. That's not just not just an imperfect copy of what happens at the center. And I'm interested in drawing out the theoretical ideas that are contained in these like borderlands points of view. So and in terms of what it means for methodological nationalism versus world history, it means that I would like to sort of look at specific ideas, debates, how the ideas, not just how they go through history, like cultural transfer, which is an important perspective, also not just comparative history, which kind of tends to take the national framework as its basis and just compares what happens in different national frameworks, but how debates take place between figures in specific movements, specific spheres, how those spheres might escape from the national framework when there's a debate, say, between a Polish socialist and a Russian socialist and a Yiddish-speaking Jewish socialist who are maybe all talking about the same territory, but they try to articulate different positionalities within this territory. And so that then brings me back to what I think we can do in looking at, in looking more concretely at the case of art that I think should be the last part of the talk, and then I'll open things up for discussion. The more I kind of circle into art, the more that I'll have to pose what I'm talking about as open questions. But these are a few questions that I want to kind of finish with. One is, what is the people of a given art? What I mean by this is, in the study of the history of art, for example, in East Central Europe, what appears as the social unit that artists claim to be addressing or representing or possibly challenging and dissolving? So do they speak to the established major arts and, for example, move to Paris or later to New York or Berlin to make a name for themselves there and try to do good art on a global scale? Or do they speak to a nation and create the nation by addressing it and representing it? Or do they establish maybe international connections that address people in multiple centers and maybe even bypass the imperial centers? And I'm also interested in asking how the people behind the art or the people of the art can be itself made into an object of artistic inquiry rather than something that's taken for granted as a background. A second question would be, how do artists relate to the socialist movements that in this period I've been talking about proposed internationalism and problematized the national frameworks that emerged in the region at this moment? So did they oppose them? Did they latch onto them? And in many cases, of course, what we see is artists who are interested in these socialist movements, but for probably significant reasons, often remain at the margins. And what does it mean when someone is active within a party versus being active on the margins, or around the party, or in a kind of as a fellow traveler? Third question. How is the international contained in the language of art? In some ways, this might, at least at first blush, appear like a straightforward question when we talk about national literature, which is supposed to be written in the emerging standard, or is actually a process of standardizing language itself when the literature is written. But since art is also made of signs, and then I would be interested in whether what is the national and the international idiom that emerges out of artistic practice in different contexts, and how does maybe a new generation of artists push against the idioms that it has inherited? Fourth question. What happens when art history ceases to be the history of major works, ceases to be a search for works that a national tradition can use to claim parity or analogy with other great traditions, and when it becomes a history of minor works? How does the world appear in these, even in a minor work of art or a system of minor works of art? And might it even appear differently or more completely in those minor works that see the world differently because they see what's been left out of the established history of art. Fifth and final question: how is the field of art itself constituted, dissolved, reconstituted in the process of imperialization, nationalization, internationalization? One case that I think is still worthy of more investigation, and I'm saying this in part because I know some of you study the avant-garde, is the question of how the interwar avant-gardes of the borderlands reacted variously to their situations, either facing a situation where they considered that the national framework of their that the previous generation of artists had been addressing, that it was already either so well established that it no longer needed to be talked about at all, or that it needed to be actively opposed and questioned, or in other cases, why it is that some other movements, like, for example, the Yiddish or the Slovenian avant-garde, feel a sense of the need to prove that their national culture can have an avant-garde and can be modernist, and so the avant-garde in those cases can become like an actual bearer of national culture in its own way. And what are the differences in these different kinds of situations? Even while they all try to reimagine the framework of art, and they try to confront art itself, breaking down the boundaries of art, as famously the avant-garde tried to do. And yeah, I'll conclude with actually saying basically what Krzysztof began with, which is that one reason I've decided I've been compelled to do this research is that I also sense that we're in kind of uncertain times when the international order is breaking down in a way that is not the same, but is somewhat reminiscent of the international order of the early 20th century, that seemed so well established and clear, and then quite quickly became completely unclear. And when we look at the debates that were happening then, we see that actually behind the scenes, although the borders on the political map weren't changing, the borders in the imagination were changing, were objects of heated debate. And I think maybe we need to, it's high time that we thought of our own order as something that should be heatedly debated, and maybe get past the reflex reaction to the situation that is to go back to what's already established and defend it against threats, and instead to think of possible other ways of reimagining the future as something that's different from the past that's being unraveled, but also different from the worst possibilities that are emerging in the present. Okay, so that was supposed to be an optimistic final statement, and yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Joe, for this amazing lecture. I believe that at a certain point we should invite you again to us and ask you to respond to your 5 questions that you raised at the end of the lecture. But at this point, I will raise maybe just 3 quick points, just by also considering the time, and I will ask you just to consider it as a menu, so that you are not expected to react on all the 3. Just choose as you wish. So my first point is that if I got it correctly, you argue that actually a large part of Central Eastern European progressive art and culture was produced, let's say, by people who were thinking out of these national boxes, but through time, these cultural products and artworks became increasingly placed back to these national containers. So there is definitely this kind of tension in this history, if I got correctly. This was a question, and the 2 other will be. This was a comment, and the 2 other will be a question. So the first question is that that decolonization became definitely a buzzword across the world, especially in the field of art and culture. Yeah, we can see new volumes coming back in every second day with titles such as Decolonize the Museum and so on and so on. And I would like to ask you that how does your concepts or framework or approach relates to such researches, especially in this region where, as you already showed, that there was not a single empire, but actually there were multiple empires or imperial projects in the picture. And the third will be maybe the most direct question, that how can the concept of borderlands internationalism approach for the time of state socialism, when actually this socialist internationalism became practically a cornerstone of state-run cultural policies. So every cultural politician was talking about socialist internationalism and socialist internationalism. Yeah, so these were my three points, and respond, and then we can open it up.
Okay, yeah, great points. To the first point, I think it's well put to say that I think there was a kind of renationalization after internationalism. I mean, I said internationalism comes after nationalism, but it doesn't replace nationalism, of course. And well, this also may be a way of getting to your third question, which is that I think part of what happened, of course, was the rise of the far right in the interwar period. But another thing that happened was that the communist parties of the region became, well, what they did was they implemented a version of internationalism that took the national framework much more, it became more traditional in the sense that it was, in some ways, it was closer to what a lot of the 19th century nationalist movements called for when they imagined that every nation could be free together. So they had an international dimension. A lot of these movements, like if you look at what Mazzini or like Mickiewicz or someone, what they write about Italian or Polish national liberation is that we will free ourselves and everyone will be free and all the nations will be free, and they don't yet have to deal with the complicated questions that will later come up about what do we do if two nations want the same territory, for example. And well, the communist position eventually crystallized as something that sort of had the same goal as a territorial nationalism, but tried to more circumspectly divide up the map so that we know which nations are where, and there was also a kind of, well, especially in the Soviet Union, but also in other places like, of course, Czechoslovakia, where there was a hierarchy of national, of nations and republics and nationalities that didn't have their own nation and so on. Didn't have their own republics and territories, and but a lot of the rhetoric, especially after the borders become fixed after World War II, after we're kind of done with the border, the population exchanges that even the Allies think is a good idea to just simplify everything and make it so that there aren't too many Germans in Poland and Czechoslovakia and so on, then they start talking about the brotherhood of nations, and of course they use it's well known that they make use of national arguments to reestablish their legitimacy. And I mean, there are two things to be said about this. One is that I still think it's worth studying the complexity of the Communist Party era, and to not just write off all of their claims of internationalism. There were some things that were, whatever the party elites thought, they were taken seriously by various actors. The fact that there was a university in in Moravia and in Czechoslovakia that educated national liberation fighters from the global south and contributed to decolonization. You know, this is a really important fact. Or the fact that Czechoslovakia invited large numbers of Vietnamese workers to come and learn skilled labor. But then to go back to Vietnam. So this was still on the assumption that people will basically stay where they are and contribute to their own nations. And this is it's partly different from already the idea you have in the interwar period, where communism is much more underdetermined. And for example, like the Czechoslovak Communist Party is the only really internationalist party in interwar Czechoslovakia, that is one party that represents Germans and Czechs and Slovaks and Hungarians in the same party. All the other parties were divided by nationality. And you have lots of activists who join the communists because they see it as the least nationalist of the parties in many parts of the region in the interwar period. Nevertheless, that said, the second aspect is I think it's still worth. This is why I want to go back a little bit earlier. Is that period is remembered, not adequately, somewhat simplistically, but is somewhat remembered. And I think this earlier moment has something to tell us that is actually more similar to our present, when there's a lot more movement and recognition of movement of people, and is more forgotten because of the later history that's been placed over it. The second question between the other two on decolonization, so you might be referring to something that I've been saying. I've written about this also, which is that I'm wary of attempts to quickly apply post-colonial and decolonial theory to East Central Europe, not because this region had nothing to do with colonialism. There are a lot of ways in which the region has been historically connected to various colonial projects, mostly indirectly, but sometimes directly. I mean, certainly the Russian Empire it colonized like the southern part of Ukraine in a very classically colonial fashion, calling it New Russia. It's a typical colonial type of name. The Habsburgs were also, for a certain moment, the rulers of the Spanish colonies. And there are many other connections. Still, what I think we have is a different logic of domination that's the primary logic of domination in Central and Eastern Europe that is different from the colonial logic of domination tends to be very strictly distinguishes between the subjects of the colony and non-subjects who are either exploited as laborers or slaves or are simply left out of the system entirely. And this leads to a kind of anti-colonialism that sees the colony as completely foreign, completely separate from native culture, and can be completely swept away, which in some cases might be a legitimate position to take. I think in most of Central and Eastern Europe, you have a much more entangled situation where imperial domination works at all sorts of different levels. People are all mixed together. You can't easily say who are the imperial subjects and who are non-imperial subjects. I mean, you can say that maybe Germans in Prague were more imperial than Czech workers who had been peasants in the previous generation. But, I mean, what do you say of someone like Kafka who speaks German but is only a generation away from the Czech countryside, where he was not, where his Czechness is also ambivalent and due to his Jewishness and so on. So I think that's just why I think it's good to think through the complexity of this imperial situation rather than too hastily applying decolonial language, even though it gains us some rhetorical points because everyone hates colonialism nowadays for good reason. It might be a shortcut that's not worth always taking.
Thank you for the responses, and now I would suggest to open up the floor, and I would suggest also to collect questions. So please raise your hand if you have some questions or comments, and I would also ask you to introduce yourself and yeah.
Hello, I'm Edith András, an art historian, and you raised many very, very interesting questions concerning how can art history use your theory. I believe in many cases Piotr Piotrowski's horizontal art history translated it into art historical language, doesn't name it minor and major, but names it center and periphery. So I would rather refer to another questions you raised that I did find very interesting, that from this international movement, this early social movement is left out. But there is a very peculiar turning around that nowadays there are the workers who are voting for the right. So this is the traditional, let's say, layers of society who could rely on, in the US, on Democrats. Now they are those who are voting for the far right. So this was one of them. The other thing which I wanted to raise that, I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more that from universalism, this kind of thinking was left out. How do you mean it in this way, or you had something different in mind? And you made a typography about that empires are mostly vertical and they suggest a civilizational project, while nationalist movement or national movements are more horizontal. And I would say that in our region, even this is complicated, because let's put, for example, the Hungarian situation, which is somehow in between the two. Half empire, but half would like to be a sovereign national. And because of this long hesitation that to give rights to the minorities, and in very late was born this Danube Confederation by Jassy, that because of this hesitation or in-betweenness is kind of the reason that this federation could not be realized. So no, I just would like to say that even those seemingly clear-cut categories could not be used in our region.
Thank you very much, Edith. Maybe there are some further questions to collect from the floor.
Hi, I'm Gábor Dobo, a literary historian, and I'm a research affiliate at the Kasek Museum. So thank you for this highly intriguing and nuanced presentation. My question is about your stance towards the term transnational or transnationality, because I've noticed that you never used this term in your presentation, even for one time, but your central term, Borderlands Internationalism, somehow resonates or seems to be compatible or similar to transnational practices, or maybe it contains transnationalism or transnational practices as well as internationalism as an ideology. So I'm asking this because in today's literary history writing and art history writing, it's almost, it's a very recurrent term, and it's also a sort of buzzword, and there are handbooks being published very often about the handbook of transnational whatever, and it would be, I'm pretty sure you left this term out on purpose, and I'm wondering what was your reason, what is your stance about toward this term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gábor. Maybe a final question from the floor? If not, I give... Okay. And then I promise I give back the mic to Joe.
Hello, I'm Magdi Gucsa and I'm art historian here at the KEMKI. And I would like to have just a remark first that I absolutely agree that this kind of contradiction of early socialist movements and the national framework, which cannot be go around, how important it is in the art history, also in the art history of the first half of the 20th century in Hungary, where even the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919, which a lot of avant-garde artists were involved in any shape or form, mainly in the administration, also engaged in a war for the national borders. So like it is really a collateral point. And I would like to have a question, which is I wrote my PhD on a minor Hungarian-born artist, and I did it in France, and I realized that maybe there is some sort of a principal forms or impressions on Eastern European internationalisms in certain national cultures. What I mean by that I realized that everyone thought first to Kafka, as you mentioned, and you mentioned it too, when they were talking about like how they can imagine Eastern European internationalism in terms of like a mix of a Jewishness, a national language, an imperial language, imperial culture, minority cultures, and all this. And I have the impression that right now we have to situate ourselves like around Kafka in some way, because we have to explain how a certain Hungarian artist, Slovakian artist, Polish artist, minor or major artists, what kind of identity constructions they have compared to Kafka, because he's so dominant in international discourses. So I would like to ask whether you have an idea that, like in the US, is it Kafka, for example, who is kind of an ideal person to demonstrate this internationalism? And what do you think? Is this really established in this discourse that we cannot avoid him, or we cannot avoid this kind of identity construction and we have to work around it until the end of the day? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for all the questions. I believe that now Joe has almost a half dozen questions and comments to react. So after your responses, I believe that I will also wrap up the conversation.
Okay. There's a lot of really important things that were said. First of all, I completely agree on the point that you can make a typology of, I think, in general, national movements. There was a structural response to imperial movements, but they always get caught somewhere in between and caught up in, well, they're inherently, probably everywhere, but especially in East Central Europe, the national movements are inherently contradictory because the basic premises couldn't be realized they couldn't be realized once they tried to implement them in practice. When it was abstract and you could say your freedom and ours, we fight for everyone's freedom together, then everyone could agree until they tried to figure out what everyone's freedom actually meant practically. And so, yeah, just like the Polish nationalist movement got caught up in what to do about Lithuania and Lithuanians and Jews and Ukrainians and Germans, then, yeah, in Hungary, exactly the problem you point out comes up. And, of course, like the Slovak national movement, which never claimed to be or never had any aspiration to be imperial the way Hungarian movement could, they still dealt with the fact eventually, once they actually gained some power, that what do we do now? We have all of these Hungarians living in Slovakia. And again, they didn't have a framework for that, except for to the extent that the communist movement had a certain like nationality policy that it could implement everywhere. But that had its own set of contradictions. So maybe that partly gets to the question of how voters vote today, but I think actually I'll leave that for the end. So let me, I'm not sure if I fully understood the question about what is left out of the imperial, just if I can clarify what I meant by the imperialism of, or the universalism of the left out.
Yeah, as far as I understood, you said that this story is totally forgotten, this socialist movement and their ideas about universalism. So let's say the leftist ideas or utopias are left out, and I wanted to contradict it with today's situation when those workers who were supposed to be leftist in the old days, now they are voting for the extreme right.
Right. Well, first, I should say that what I mean by what is left out is more this historical process of whatever claim is made in the historic moment by, for example, by these socialist movements themselves, where they would say, your national movement, first, your imperial movement didn't notice us, and then your national movement also didn't notice us, or didn't include us, and that's why we have to speak now, and we have to claim voice for the workers, or voice for the workers who happen to be of X nationality. But looking to the present, we can see how there is this. Well, there are a lot of different kinds of being left out. That certainly, I don't see the kind of claim for representation of what's left out as an inherently, necessarily leftist claim in itself. Clearly, like, part of Trump's rhetoric was, I speak for the forgotten voices of those who kind of liberalism left out. But I think Orban also, kind of, at least in the beginning especially, would say, liberalism has forgotten all of us regular people. What I think is leftist is more this second moment where claiming that what has been left out should be brought back in, but then that there's still a challenge to make this a part of something bigger that can be coherently a part of a future transformed world. This is why I see internationalism as historically connected to the socialist movement, even though there can be socialists who claim to be both socialists and nationalists. The difference between internationalism and some other forms of universalism is that it imagined a different future, and the socialist movement at this historical moment was the one movement that was really imagining a possibly completely different future. And what we have now is, well, in most of the world, the absence of a strong imagination of a different future, and so we're kind of stuck with this one claim to defend the established order, and then a kind of conservative claim to go back to some previous order, or defend something that seems to be something that seems to be under threat. Actually, I'd say both liberalism and conservatism these days both say that our order is under threat by you, and we have to defend it in some way, rather than reimagining something different in the future. So that's not a complete explanation of all the reasons that working class voters choose the right, but I think it's part of it is this absence of a different kind of political horizon. As for the transnational, it was deliberate not to mention the transnational, not because I completely reject the term, but I see it as a different kind of term that, well, it does two things. One is that it tends to focus on practices which happen to cross national boundaries, and I I think that's really key. It's necessary to study these practices, and there's been a lot of research that already looks at transnational practices, and sometimes they call it internationalism, like solidarity between one movement in one place and one movement in another place, and that's really crucial. But I'm interested in the ideas and the imagination that comes up, and the transnational is usually not, it usually doesn't evoke a new kind of imagination. It evokes more this process and this kind of movement. The other reason that I think that I don't make it my primary category is that I think sometimes the way transnational is used as a term, it can actually take for granted the different national units and contexts, and it's about something that happens, something that might straddle different national contexts, but the national contexts themselves are taken for granted, which in much of the world is valid. I mean, if we're not calling into question the borders and the possible reconfiguration of some order of states or non-states, then that might be the most relevant category. But I'm interested in these moments when actually what the national is to begin with is also called into question. As for Kafka, he casts a long shadow. I don't think it's any different in the US. I'd say if you think about Eastern Europe, either people know about all the nationalism over there or they know about Kafka. So I guess it's a kind of an inroad for people to understand that there's something else. Sometimes they see, there's also Bruno Schulz, who is a bit like Kafka, but in Poland. Or Kafka himself is almost becoming a major literature, as a one-man major literature that becomes this grand signifier of so many things. I bring him up because it's interesting to see how Deleuze and Guattari also found him. He's basically their only interest in Eastern and Central Europe, as far as I can tell, is through Kafka. I mean, I'm not an expert on their whole body of work, but it's the only thing I'm aware of. But I think we can also a bit more depth can find many Kafkas and many other complex situations that can show us new possibilities, maybe, for thinking through all this stuff.
Thank you very much, Joe. I believe that it was a really thought-provoking lecture, and you left us a lot of things to digest and debate. So thank you very much for your presentation.